Hello, everyone. My name is Francisco López. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Computing Science at University in Sweden. And the authors of this work include me, Dr. Lars Karlsson, and Professor Paolo Bientinesi, both of them being my doctoral supervisors. This talk I'm going to present our work titled Flops as a Discriminant for Dense Linear Algebra Algorithms. We will briefly start with an introduction and motivation for this work, and then we will quickly jump into the meat of the research. Linear algebra expressions are operations that manipulate matrices and vectors. These expressions, such as the ones shown here, are at the heart of countless applications and programs in both science and industry. These expressions can be found in a myriad of fields, such as artificial intelligence, molecular biology, computational chemistry, and computer vision. Besides, underneath the most popular applications and services, there are also many dense linear algebra expressions getting computed under the hood. And usually the time required to evaluate these expressions can have a substantial impact on the overall performance of the greater application. And for this reason, the problem of translating linear algebra expressions into efficient code is central in high-performance computing. Over the past decades, the community identified and optimized a relatively small set of basic kernels that perform basic operations. And these can be used as building blocks to evaluate more complex expressions. The BLAS and LAPACK libraries are two of the most prominent results of these efforts. Manually translating an expression into efficient code is an extremely difficult task, and it requires thorough knowledge of both numerical linear algebra and the target computing platform. And with the existence of these portable libraries, we can transfer the problem of evaluating an expression into mapping the expression into a sequence of kernel calls. These sequences of kernel calls or invocations is what we refer to as algorithms. However, hardly any expression is uniquely translated into a single algorithm, a sequence of kernel invocations. On the contrary, it's not unusual to find even hundreds of algorithms for a given expression. And these algorithms, while all mathematically equivalent, typically present different flop counts and execution times. And here we show, for example, the algorithms for the generalized least square expression. And although we avoid explicitly specifying all of them, the components. And as a note, these algorithms do not necessarily perform the same number of kernel calls. So K1, K2, and so on, etc., are not the same number. The problem then boils down to selecting an algorithm that is reliably amongst the fastest of from this set of mathematically equivalent algorithms. And this is, of course, settled in for a specific combination of library implementation and computer architecture. In general, when solving the mapping while minimizing a particular metric, as for example the execution time, we say that we are solving the linear algebra mapping problem, also known as LAMP. Putting things in a bigger context, the major problem we are trying to solve is having an expression with operand sizes and properties, a set of kernels to invoke from, and craft a piece of software that outputs the algorithm that takes the minimum execution time. Nowadays, popular languages and frameworks perform certain optimizations to the output code, but they don't guarantee the solution will take the minimum execution time, and it's only restricted to certain types of expressions. We also have other tools or programming languages, such as Linear or Julia, that provide a solution that is based on minimizing the number of flops to perform, which is a natural proxy for solving the problem with the minimum execution time. In the case of Julia, this only applies to certain expressions, but even so, they rely on the number of flops. A research question here is how good of a discriminant between algorithms is the number of flops when our objective is minimizing the execution time that it takes to evaluate the expression. In general, it's widely accepted that minimizing the number of flops is not the same as minimizing the execution time, but we are constraining ourselves in this case to highly optimized kernels, and this state of the art is no better than just minimizing the flop counts. Therefore, to study this, in this paper, we focused on experimentally studying what we call anomalies. And these are expressions, instances for which the cheapest algorithms are not amongst the fastest. And to measure the severity of the anomalies, we define two metrics, the time score and the flop score. And these two metrics are only defined for anomalous instances and measure the relative difference between the cheapest and the fastest algorithms for a particular expression in terms of time and flops, respectively. As an example, a time score of 10% means that the fastest algorithm takes 90% of the time of the cheapest, or actually the fastest of the cheapest. On the other hand, a flop score of 20% means that the cheapest algorithm performs an 80% of the flop count of the fastest. To put it simply, the greater these scores, these two scores, the more severe the anomaly is. We typically include a certain threshold in terms of time score to classify an instance as anomaly. Typically, we choose this to be of 10%, and to avoid, this is done to avoid tagging as anomalies instances for which the difference between fastest and cheapest is negligible. The existence of anomalies is justified by the fact that not all kernels present the same efficiency, and what's more, the same kernel has a different efficiency depending on the sizes of the input operands. The efficiency is defined as the ratio between the performance of the kernel in flops per second and the theoretical peak performance of the computing platform. So it's unitless. The efficiency is unitless. In the figure, in this figure here, we show the efficiency of GEM, CIRC, and SEM in our experimental setup that we will mention later. And their efficiencies are plotted as a function of the size of the input operands when all operands are square matrices. We can also observe, as of approximately this size here, that their efficiency plateaus when the input sizes reach a certain dimension. And this is generally true for most kernels in BLAS and LAPACK. And it's important to bear in mind that these kernels have different flop counts, and therefore the algorithms created from these kernel invocations will have different flop counts. In our work here, we consider all operands to be unstructured, and this means only the dimensions, so the sizes of the operands, and not the value of the individual elements, have an impact on the overall efficiency of the algorithms. To experimentally study anomalies, we need expressions to experiment on. And in this case, we chose two expressions. The first one is A times B times C times D, also known as the matrix chain. For this particular expression, the instances are identified by the tuple D0, D1, and so on until D4, which are basically dimensions of the operands. To evaluate this expression, we only use GEM, which is, GEM is known to be the, what is considered as the most optimized piece of code in scientific computing. Basically, if we find anomalies for this expression, we'll probably find anomalies or many more anomalies for others, including a more varied set of kernels. And we consider here the different parameterizations and the orders of execution. So we have basically 6 different algorithms, and all of them are represented in the bottom left side of the slide right now, and it is where we can see the formation of the algorithms for the matrix chain. And each path from the root node at the top to a leaf node represents an algorithm. The second expression we consider is A times A transpose times B, and this one doesn't really have a proper name. It's just the expression by itself. The instances of this expression are identified by the tuple D0, D1, D2. To evaluate this expression, we make use of GEM, CIRC, and SEM and the different parameterizations. On the bottom right side of this slide, we can see now the analogous figure for the algorithms of this expression. In this case, we have 5 different algorithms. 4 of them come from the left path in the figure, this one here, and just one comes from the right path, being this one, 2 consecutive gems. For both expressions, the algorithm's flop counts depend on the kernel calls, as we mentioned before, and obviously the dimensions of the specific instance that we are evaluating. It's also important to remember that the kernel's efficiencies also depend on the specific instance. To study and analyze anomalies, we designed a set of experiments. The first experiment has as an objective searching for anomalies with random sampling to determine the severity and abundance of anomalies. This is basically looking for how often we find anomalies and what's the intensity or the severity of these. The second experiment is designed to explore regions around the anomalies to determine whether these are isolated. And we will mention later why this is of importance. And finally, the third and last experiment is designed to find whether anomalies can be predicted even when we use very simple methods, like predictions from benchmark kernel data. For all of these experiments, our experimental setup consists of an Intel Xeon Silver 4210 with 10 physical cores and Turbo Boost enabled 40 gigabytes of RAM memory, and we linked against the MKL version 2019.0.5. Although this version is old, it may very well be a implementation of BLAS and LAPACK many users might be using when they use Python or MATLAB nowadays, if they haven't really updated everything. And finally, it's important to mention that the experiments have a search space restricted between 20 and 1200. And the upper limit is chosen so anomalies can exist, since, as we saw before, performances or efficiencies plateau when certain sizes are reached. For the first experiment, we randomized the dimensions of all operands within the search space, and we tested whether the instance or all the instances are anomalies, which ones of them. This way, for the first expression, we looked for 100 anomalies, and this number of anomalies was chosen so we could perform all the experiments within a certain frame of time, since anomalies are very rare to happen for this expression. We had to test almost 23,000 samples to find 100 anomalies, which gives us an estimated density of 0.4% in the search space. The 100 anomalies are represented in the figure shown on the left side. And on the vertical axis, we have the time score, whereas on the horizontal axis, we have the flop score. The higher the time score, the more difference there is between the fastest and the cheapest algorithms, and also the greater the flop score, the more difference in terms of flops there is between cheapest and fastest. As an example, take the rightmost anomaly in the figure. This one right here. For that specific instance, the cheapest algorithm computes 45% fewer flops than the fastest algorithm, but the fastest takes approximately 27% less time. For the other expression, we show here the analogous figure. In this case, we looked for 1,000 anomalies for which we had to test a bit more than 10,000 instances. And this gives us a density of almost 10%, which means in turn that almost for the 10% of the instances in this expression, the cheapest algorithm takes at least 10% more time than the fastest. It's also important to notice that in both expressions, there are anomalies for which the cheapest and the fastest perform almost the same number of flops. And there might be even a difference of 35% in execution time, such as this one and this one right here. With the second experiment, we want to find out whether anomalies are isolated or not. And to do this, we explore the regions around the anomalies. However, mapping the entire regions was computationally infeasible So instead, we took the initial anomalies from the previous experiment, from experiment 1, and intersected them with axes aligned with lines in all dimensions. For the matrix chain expression, this means traversing the axis centered on each of the previously found anomalies. We used a jump of 10 units, a step of 10 units, to make the experiment feasible in terms of time. And here we used the definition of a region's thickness, which is understood as the number of units between the boundaries of the anomalous regions. This is basically how many consecutive anomalous instances we find when a particular dimension is modified, having the center placed on a certain initial anomaly. In the figure we show now, we represent for each of the dimensions being modified, the thickness of the anomalous regions. And this is, for example, for the leftmost figure, when D0 is modified, this one right here, for all previous anomalies, how many consecutive anomalies are found. The anomalies are then sorted based on the thickness of the regions to get an idea of the distribution of the thicknesses for each dimension. And looking at this figure, we can state that anomalies, even for the matrix chain, are not isolated since they mostly belong to anomalous regions. Indeed, there are even some regions that span throughout almost the entirety of the search space, such as these, or even these here. With the information we have from the traversals, we could also understand what happens in the boundaries of the anomalous regions. And for this purpose, we show here two specific regions. Each row corresponds to one of the 6 algorithms for the matrix chain, while the columns correspond to different initial anomalies. And here we have represented the efficiency of the individual kernels and the total algorithms altogether. The boundaries of the regions are represented with red vertical dotted lines, and the color backgrounds mean that specific algorithm is the fastest if the color is green, cheapest if red, and brown if both. And we observe that there are 2 types of behavior in terms of kernels efficiencies in the boundaries. So sometimes there are abrupt changes in efficiency, such as we can see here. Yep, which causes the onset of an anomalous region, whereas in the other cases, the transition is more gradual. And we did the same for the second expression, for which we individually modified each of the 3 dimensions for each of the 1,000 previously found anomalies. In the analogous figure, we represent the thicknesses of the regions in each of the dimensions for the anomalies. We can observe that in this case, the thicknesses tend to be greater, and in particular for D2, D2, most of the regions take the entirety of the search space. Since we also have plenty of data from all these traversals, we also studied the boundaries of these anomalous regions. And here we show, again, each algorithm in a different row and each anomalous regions in a different column. And these regions were completely picked at random, and we observe that in the leftmost one, the region takes 300 units, which is representative of this distribution, while and for the other ones, they almost take the entirety of the length of the search space, which also kind of represents both. And here we also observe both types of transitions in the boundaries of the regions. With the third experiment, the final one, we wanted to find out whether anomalies could be predicted. And to do so, we benchmarked each of the kernels in isolation with a flush cache, basically cleansing the cache before each measurement was taken. And this way, for each kernel invocation from experiment 2, we obtained a benchmark execution time. And by summing over the code in any given algorithm, we obtained a prediction of the execution time for each of the algorithms. So the results can be summarized in a confusion matrix with the actual unpredicted classifications. And for the first expression, 92% of the anomalies could have been predicted from only the benchmark data, and 96% of the anomalies predicted were actually true anomalies. Finally, we did the same with the second expression. In this case, 75% of the anomalies could have been predicted from the benchmark data, and 98.5% of the predicted anomalies were through anomalies. As an overall result, we can observe that even when using such a simple strategy to detect anomalies, the results can mean the avoidance of these performance pitfalls. And finally, I'd like to summarize the conclusions of our work. From experiment 1, we obtained that anomalies can be abundant even for simple expressions. And we have to say that the expressions used in our work are rather simple since they present very few algorithms compared to way more real expressions, or the amount of algorithms we could find from more real expressions. And the algorithms in our case use even fewer kernels. Using a more varied set of kernels will most likely increase the variability in the kernel's efficiencies, and this will translate in turn into anomalies being more frequent. From experiment 2, we proved that anomalies tend to cluster together in contiguous regions. And just in the next slide, we'll see, well, I will briefly comment why this might be important. And in the experiment 3, we just saw that anomalies can be predicted even with very simple strategies, and that means we could create mechanisms to avoid them. Also, just as a final general note, knowing about the location of abrupt changes in performance profiles might help identify regions of severe anomalies, and this in turn might be useful to solve the linear algebra mapping problem with symbolic sizes. Besides, the qualitative conclusions we have obtained here are likely to generalize. A different setup or different plus Algebra implementation will affect the performance of the performance profiles of the kernels, which in turn will translate into the disappearance of some anomalies and the search of new ones. And because of this, we support that flop counts may very well fail to be a reliable discriminant for a given linear algebra expression in general, even more when the expression is complex and presents many algorithms, which is the final objective. And as a final note, I'd like to mention that in view of our results, there is value and need in designing a more robust algorithm selection methodology suitable not just for simple expressions, but for more complex expressions and or problems with symbolic sizes. In doing so, we'll be closer to selecting optimal algorithms to evaluate linear algebra expressions. And that's all on my side, from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to listening to your questions in the Q&A. Thanks again. Bye-bye.